good afternoon to everyone watching. My name is Patryk Miernowski, and I'm an analyst for the Ordo Iuris International Law Center. Today, it is my pleasure to be joined by Mr. Brian Brown, who came here a long way from the United States, the president of the World Congress of Families and the co-founder of the National Organization for Marriage. As well, joining us live is Mr. Alessandro Fiore, a member of the Italian organization Vita et Familia, fighting for the values of life and family. And later on, we will also hear the declarations, the speeches of Mrs. Sharon Slater, the president of the Family Watch International, a great non-profit organization with a consultative status with the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations. We will also hear from Reverend Professor Harrison G. Olan'g from the International Baptist Church, joining us from Arusha, Tanzania, and Mrs. Salome van der Wende, representing the Dutch branch of the great organization One of Us, which is probably one of the most representative global pro-life movements present in 24 European member states of the EU, aiming at the protection of human life, dignity, and especially active in the field of the protection of the unborn. Thank you all for your presence. We have gathered here today because of a very worrisome event of great implications, which is the upcoming conclusion of the partnership agreement between the European Union and the Organization of the African, Caribbean, and Pacific States, the former ACP, now known as the OACPS, the Organization of the aforementioned states. This partnership, even though it does not enjoy wide media coverage, constitutes an important part of the international legal order. It associates more than 1/5 of the global population, including all members of the European Union, as well as 79 members of the OACPS countries. When combined, these states form an impressive majority of over 106 to be precise countries of the United Nations, which is more than the simple majority of 50% required to pass most resolutions on the General Assembly. And this agreement would be binding upon all of these states. Therefore, its provisions would have far-reaching consequences for the entirety of the global community. The new agreement is set to supersede the old Cotonou Agreement, which was concluded a long time ago in the year 2000 by the 15 states of the EU, as well as the ACP countries, and which is aimed at fostering the economic and social cooperation and development between these regions. But why are we even talking about a seemingly peripheral agreement? Well, as much as obviously we welcome the idea of cooperation and view it as mutually beneficial, we are saddened and troubled to see that the new agreement, contrary to its predecessor, has some dangerous underlying ideological connotations which should not be overlooked, and we believe they should be addressed. In addition to the provisions about human and social development, peace, security, international cooperation, the protection of the climate and the environment, and so on, as important as these issues themselves are, this agreement smuggles through some worrisome provisions about the highly controversial and radical term of the so-called sexual and reproductive health and rights, as well as, for example, the obligation to promote the gender perspective by its signatories. These concepts are contested on the grounds of being contrary to the basic biologically driven term of sex. They are contested not only in the countries of the ACP, but also in substantial parts of Europe itself, as well exemplified by the staunch resistance that the Istanbul Convention has met. Even today, almost half of the population of the Council of Europe has the states representing almost half of the population of the Council of Europe. They have not accepted this Istanbul Convention due to the concept of gender, among others. In the text of the agreement, the parties are directly and openly obliged to acknowledge and accept the narrative that gender inequality deprives women of their basic human rights and opportunities. By virtue of the agreement, the parties are bound to undertake and to prevent, combat, and prosecute all forms of gender-based violence and discrimination, as well as to combat deeply rooted gender bias, which obviously implies in our opinion, in a very unjustified and unfounded way, that such bias exists in our societies. Aside from imposing specific obligations on the signatory states, the draft agreement also contains specific solutions pertaining to the creation of supranational institutions, which shall be entitled to make decisions in the name of the states, all signatories, and which, for the most part, will be dominated by the representatives of the EU. And by that, I mean the organs of the European Union. This is something that most Europeans do not really have much control over. What's extremely worrying is that these institutions would have the competences to adopt decisions pertaining to the adoption of joint positions and undertaking joint actions on the international stage, which again would be binding. Some of the most radical implications of this agreement could arise from the norms which are conveyed in a very deceptive, indirect, and non-transparent form, which makes them difficult to decipher by most politicians and negotiators of these countries, of the ACP countries, which the populations of which are in principle very much opposed to these progressive far-left concepts. Also, let us keep in mind that many of the countries involved in this partnership are very much dependent on support from the partnership with the EU. And in reality, they have no other option, no other viable path than to accept this agreement, even if their societies, as I said before, in principle oppose the agreement's provisions. And in the view of what I have just mentioned, I think it's difficult not to see this as not to perceive this agreement as a way of subjugating the states of the global south to the ideological pressure of the EU and making further cooperation conditional on accepting this radical far-left agenda of sexual rights and reproductive rights, as well as gender ideology. We believe this whole situation should be seen as a new edition of European colonialism, but this time, instead of proliferating values of Christian and traditionally understood European culture, a colonialism which aims at the deconstruction of the ACP countries' moral, cultural, and even legal norms. In order to quench this ideological crusade of some states of the EU, again, this is not representative of the views of the entire European Union, as I think it is well exemplified by the fact that there is big resistance to these concepts in the EU, as I said before. At the Ordo Iuris Institute for Legal Culture, we have undertaken a series of actions aimed at stopping this endeavor while we still can. We have prepared a detailed memorandum on the subject, which is available on our webpage, and which we have already shared with many decisive people on both the Polish and European political stage. But most importantly, together with many like-minded organizations from all over the globe, we are now launching an initiative aimed at fighting this neocolonial project. And this is where I make room for my guests of today to say a few words about the issue from their perspective. Maybe let's start with people who are connecting online to make sure that the technicalities don't disturb us further on. So, Mr. Alessandro Fiore, the floor is yours. Can you hear us? I hope so.
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you for the invitation for today. I can hear okay, that's all right now. Very well. Okay, so yeah, thank you for the invitation. I have a bit of a cold, so don't mind my voice. Yeah, as you said, today, unfortunately, the EU's institutions are pervaded by a culture that we could call a culture of death, exacerbated individualism, and the most dangerous nihilism. And sometimes they culturally attack countries that still defend life and the natural family. Just see, for instance, the fury that's towards Poland in recent times. So Vita Familia, which is the association that I represent, joins the initiative of Ordo Iuris Institute for Legal Culture in opposition to the signing of the cooperation agreement between the European Union and the Organization of African, Caribbean and Pacific States, as currently proposed. Together with Ordo Iuris, we want also to encourage the Polish government and the governments of other European countries that do not agree with the EU's anti-family and anti-life agenda to reject this agreement, thus protecting the international legal order and true human rights. The African and Caribbean countries still have high regard for the values of life and the natural family, and respect the love open to life of a man and a woman as the principle and the basis of civil society. They would be forced to adhere to anti-human, anti-life, and anti-family policies, now represented by the EU institutions and international bodies. In particular, the UN General Assembly, in the UN General Assembly, these ideologies are now unable to prevail, often thanks to the contrary vote of these countries. So if a voting union were created that would oblige them to adhere to the EU's positions, the culture of death would easily prevail in the UN General Assembly. His Eminence, Cardinal Robert Sarah, a native of Guinea, has repeatedly denounced that much is being imposed on Africa as a condition for receiving economic aid. Africans must accept, for example, abortions, condoms, female sterilization, gender ideology, and so on. In some African countries, ministers have been created dedicated to gender theory in exchange for economic aid. Some governments have already succumbed to pressure for general access to sexual and reproductive rights. Also, the treaty that we oppose subordinates EU cooperation and assistance to African countries to the adoption of common positions, as has already been mentioned, in the assemblies of the United Nations, thus forcing the African and Caribbean countries to vote in unison with the EU. These common positions concerning the ideological agendas of the EU institutions are very often widely refused by African people, for example. There seems to be a plan to eliminate the poor and not poverty in Africa and elsewhere. And after contraception, abortion, and gender, maybe also euthanasia will be imposed on Africans and others, a practice that in the West has become the new ideological battle of postmodernity. It's the clearest sign of a godless, infrahuman society that has lost hope. With the help of the media, the wolves pretend to be generous lambs alongside the weakest. In Italy, we have already seen, even though not yet in its full extent, where the mortiferous ideologies promoted, amongst others by the EU, lead. Demographic winter, one of the lowest fertility rates, and one of the oldest nations in the world. A widespread individualism. A country, I'm talking about Italy, where media and politics create an uproar if someone, as recently seen, publicly expresses opposition to abortion. So African, Caribbean, and Pacific states, stay faithful to life and family. Thank you very much.
Much appreciated. I really like what you have to say. Your perspective is very valuable here. Now let's hear from Reverend Professor Harrison G. Olan'g from the International Baptist Church.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Harrison Olan'g. I'm calling from Arusha, Tanzania, East Africa. I'm calling to discuss briefly about the content and context of the agreement between the European Union and the Organization of Africa, Caribbean, and Pacific States, which has drawn the attention of legal experts regarding its moral implications within various communities. According to Ordo's Iuris Institute of Legal Culture, the way in which these goals are understood and how they are to be accomplished should be seen as detrimental in member states of European Union, and for that matter, I would say even to the other parties who have signed or intending to sign the agreement. The main issue of discontent in the use of terms such as reproductive and sexual rights, gender perspective, or gender-based violence. Applied in a context rife with confusion, misunderstanding, and moral degradation, those words may carry with them serious cultural, moral, and ethical questionable implications within various moral communities, and therefore should be revisited or, if necessary, be withdrawn from the agreement. In an era of democracy as a global political ideology, the concept of mighty is right should not be applied in any way at the expense of other people's moral and ethical rights.
Thank you, Reverend, for your message. Much appreciated. Now let us hear what Mrs. Salome van der Wende from the organization One of Us has to say.
Dear fellow citizens of the world, my name is Salome van der Wende, and I'm speaking on behalf of One of Us, the Netherlands. As a former abortion patient, I've spoken in various countries, including Africa. My country, the Netherlands, has the International Criminal Court and the Peace Palace, and yet we export death. Back in 1881, the Netherlands started the new Malthusian Union with a man named Rutgers. And if we move forward, this has become the Rutgers World Population Foundation. Two Dutch people helped start the International Planned Parenthood Foundation. The gynecologist of the royal family, Dr. Hospels, developed the morning after pill and also started the development of the abortion pill. She Decides was birthed in the Netherlands. Women on Waves. Women on Web, where abortion pills can be ordered. Our tentacles are wide, seeking who can be devoured to further depopulate our planet. The alphabet gender types are lavishly promoted, and we are the first country to legalize euthanasia, a slippery slope. We developed the HEC 293 and the PER C6 aborted baby cell lines for experiments and currently used in some of the vaccines development, production and testing for COVID. Our first abortion clinic opened in 1971. We torture, we mutilate, starve and tear arms and legs off our babies. Should we ever be allowed to decapitate and dismember a child? Should children be objects and discarded? Instead of being subjects of a country, they're citizens, needed for a healthy economic climate down the road? Our laws allow all this. It says nothing of the dignity of the babies, but it says everything about us as the adults. You get the picture. We are alarmed at the plans of a possible partnership between the EU and the African, Caribbean, Pacific countries, states. Why? Well, this could lead to an impressive majority of 106 votes in the General Assembly of the United Nations, which would make it easy to pass most resolutions, which could be binding. What effect would this have on the world? If this partnership forms a bloc, then this in turn could roll out more horrific laws around the world. Can you imagine Bolivia or Argentina forcing their laws on you? Is it possible that this could lead to further depopulation schemes that are already well underway and gaining traction? Have you heard of the term useless eaters? Through clever smokescreens, euphemisms, and non-transparent words, life issues are lured into the spiderweb, pushing feminist agendas, euthanasia, gender, etc., despite numerous treaties which recognize, for example, the right to life. How about furthering the comprehensive sex education to strip children of their innocence? Or like an 11-year-old that dropped a card which said, "Can you smell one's pubic hair?" We are concerned that these partnerships will override a state sovereignty and will not be in the best interest of the member state. Just like abortion is not in the best interest of a child, causing unnatural and premature death to the vulnerable, unable to defend themselves. Given the history of the Netherlands, do we want to enable the further rolling out of these so-called human rights against humanity? Be aware. Do we want to have a larger bloc to push this agenda on other unsuspecting countries? Like the Hoover Dam, this agenda needs to be held back. Let's not sleepwalk into the abyss. If you could choose, what would you choose?
Thanks so much for such an inspiring speech. On a short technical note, a person whom I have announced, Mrs. Sharon Slater from the Family Watch, sadly, we won't be able to hear her speech because of some technical issues, at least for now. But in that case, the floor is yours, Mr. Brown.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much to Ordo Iuris for all the great work you do. Alessandro, it's great to see you and all the work that Vita, Familia do in Italy and around the world. It's a great pleasure to be able to be here in Poland and to talk a little bit about the partnership agreement between the European Union and the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States. Along with the other organizations speaking here today, the International Organization for the Family is strongly opposed to this agreement because, to put it simply, it is a stealth attempt to impose a radical abortion and gender ideology agenda on the developing world. During the Trump administration, the United States was strongly opposed to imposing neocolonialism on the developing world by tying foreign aid to a country adopting pro-abortion and pro-LGBT policies. Yet this is exactly what this proposed agreement is attempting to do. If we look at the language of the agreement, it requires signatory states to, quote, support universal access to sexual and reproductive health commodities and healthcare services. That's in Article 29.5. As most international observers know, this phrase is coded language for requiring access to abortion. Many left-wing governments and international bodies, including the European Union and many of its member states, are attempting to smuggle a right to abortion into international agreements by using this specific language regarding sexual and reproductive health and rights, which has no universally recognized definition. Why are they doing this? Because there is no internationally recognized right to abortion. This fact was recently emphasized in the Geneva Consensus Declaration signed by over 30 countries, including almost 20 countries from the African, Caribbean, and Pacific regions, and by Poland and Hungary from the European Union. I'm very proud that this occurred under the Trump administration and was led by Valerie Huber. Unfortunately, the United States, with the coming of the Biden administration, quickly withdrew. The Geneva Consensus Declaration specifically committed signatory states to, quote, reaffirm that there is no international right to abortion nor any international obligation on the part of states to finance or facilitate abortion. The Trump administration did all it could to remove language referencing sexual and reproductive health and rights from United Nations and other international documents because of the intentional misinterpretation of this phrase. The Trump administration did even more than this by prohibiting any global health assistance from going to international organizations. Unfortunately, much of this good work has now been undermined by the Biden administration, as I said before, including withdrawing the United States from the Geneva Consensus Declaration. But I am proud to say that those behind it are continuing to add new signatories and have not given up. And we're waiting for a better day and working towards a better day when the United States will again sign on. One additional point, the proposed agreement is attempting to foist a radical gender agenda on the developing world. Again, we need to look at the specific language. It obligates signatory states to, quote, systematically promote a gender perspective and ensure that gender equality is mainstreamed across all policies. Again, you have to look at the specific use of these terms and what they are code words, what they signify. Gender and gender equality have no internationally recognized definitions. And left-wing international organizations and governments are trying to smuggle that language in to support radical transgender policies under them. The United States currently is interpreting these terms to require allowing biological males who identify as female to use the bathroom, locker rooms, and showers reserved for biological females, to compete against biological females in sporting competitions, and to stay in domestic violence shelters reserved for biological females. In a recent high-profile case in the United States, a biological male wearing a skirt was allowed to use a bathroom reserved for girls and subsequently raped a female student there. This actually had quite a bit to do with the recent election of a conservative governor in Virginia, because so many people, so many parents realized that this had a direct impact on them. This isn't just something pie in the sky, that gender ideology will affect you. All these new policies that support the transgender agenda are attempting to negate the hard-won gains of females over the past 100 years. It should also be noted that the agreement requires signatories to, quote, prevent, combat, and prosecute all forms of gender-based violence and discrimination. Now, again, that doesn't sound like it's something bad, but you have to look at what this language is used to do. What does it mean? The United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women has held that restrictions on abortion can be considered gender-based violence. When you hear the word violence, gender-based violence, you don't think that that's supporting abortion, but committees in the United Nations do. They say that the reason that prohibiting abortion can be considered gender-based violence is, quote, because they cause mental and physical suffering, constituting violence against women and potentially amounting to torture or cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. No language here about the baby. Language here attempting to claim that it's cruel and inhuman to protect the baby and to equate laws protecting life with gender-based violence. It seems as if you are down the rabbit hole in Alice in Wonderland. Language does not mean what it is supposed to mean. Words that have clear meaning do not mean what they are supposed to mean. Instead, opposing gender-based violence becomes an obligation to support the culture of death. Most countries in Africa, the Caribbean, and Pacific regions strongly support a culture of life and the natural family. Indeed, countries in these regions have given crucial support in defeating attempts by those in the EU and elsewhere to impose radical ideology on the international community. Yet this proposed partnership can easily be used by these same governments to force signatories not only to repudiate support for pro-life and pro-family policies within their countries, but also to support radical abortion and transgender policies on the international level. Again, let's be very clear. This is a blatant attempt at ideological colonialism, an attempt that must be stopped at all costs. For this reason, the International Organization for the Family and the World Congress of Families stands in solidarity with all of the other organizations that have spoken today in opposing the partnership agreement and all other agreements that attempt to impose a radical pro-abortion gender ideology upon the rest of the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing your American perspective with us. Much appreciated. Thank you for your presence as well. And once again, I would like to express my gratitude to everyone who has spoken, to everyone who is watching us, and to everyone who cares about this issue. I hope our initiative will be successful in not only in stopping this post-Cotonou agreement from being accepted and entering into force, but also, as Mr. Brown has outlined, this is a very dangerous precedent. It can be used, this mechanism which is being established here, let's hope it doesn't get established, can be also mobilized in the future in the name of wrongly perceived social progress, which is something which we cannot allow to happen. At the very end, I would like to kindly ask and invite everyone who is watching, everyone who is watching us, to go to our webpage dedicated to the initiative. You can find the link in the description of the YouTube stream or the video for those of you who are watching from the future, and sign the declaration. We have a declaration which is aimed not only at non-governmental organizations, but any private person is also very warmly welcome to join our initiative. And please spread the awareness if you can, and let's hope that with such broad cooperation and help of so many great organizations and great people from all over the world, we can manage to stop this dangerous precedent and make the world a better and safer place. Thank you very much.
Thank you.